It's really cold outside, so it's nice it's warm inside. We're really excited because we can't believe it's May and we're already into our next meetup, and we've got lots of cool people coming tonight, and we've got great speakers. And I think it's really important that often for enterprise space we don't think about a lot of the detail, a lot of the behaviour and how people think and why they think and what they do. And so tonight having two organisational psychologists talk, I think gives us a really interesting lens on what happens in the enterprise space. So it's super exciting. So firstly, I have Johanna Tibbertsma, and she is speaking on measuring UX and CX and how that can, what some of the barriers could be to doing that. So she's the customer experience designer at icare, and it's going to be super exciting to hear her speak. So without more to do, I will throw up her presentation and we will be good to go. So please welcome Johanna.
Okay, so I was at a conference about a year and a half ago, and it was a service design conference, and I noticed that while all of the designers were speaking incredibly passionately about a lot of the work that they were doing in their organisations, very few were actually talking about the impacts that their work has had on the organisations in which they work. So I approached one of these speakers at the end of her talk and I asked her, how do you convince stakeholders to hire your agency besides blind faith? And she said to me, well, a lot of the time, by the time they reach our agency, they've tried everything. And I thought, but a little bit of a problem here potentially. In the industry as well, we hear a lot of talk about hypotheses and experimentation and the scientific method, but one of the really critical points of the scientific method that often gets ignored is the idea of analysis and measurement. Now, UX and CX professionals are going to be under increasing pressure to prove the value of UX and CX investment and also the value of our profession as a whole. So I feel like we're really good at some of that qualitative stuff and sharing compelling user and customer stories. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of the quantitative stuff and the impact that's really going to give us credibility. So I got to thinking, what are some of the barriers to measuring our success? Because if we can understand the barriers, then we can sort of make some efforts to get around those. And three sort of leading ideas came to me. One is that we don't really know how. One is that we don't really understand or believe why. And the third is that we don't want to. I'm going to go into these into a little bit more depth and hopefully provide some recommendations for how you can overcome some of these challenges. Some of it might seem a little bit intuitive to some of you, and in major organisations this might not be something you have to worry about too much, but quant is unbelievably useful to get your head around. And it's important to stretch our thinking beyond qualitative feedback and NPS as well. Okay, so I feel like I can already feel some of you recoiling into your seat. And I know quant is intimidating, but half the problem of measuring our success is that we actually don't collect the upfront baseline measures, and therefore at the end of our project, how can we say that anything has changed? Because we don't realise until the end what we should have measured. And if we don't think to ask for the metrics up front because we don't know what to ask for. So here's some tactical stuff just to get you started and get some of that inspiration flowing. So we can think about measurement across three really broad categories. The first is solicited. So this is the stuff that you ask people for, just questions you ask them. Really, people tend to have a pretty good grasp of these survey items, reasons for return, customer satisfaction scores. Then behavioural metrics. These are observable behaviours that we can kind of track people doing or observe people doing. So browsing behaviour, purchases, app installs, uninstalls, subscribe, unsubscribe. There's masses of data of this in the digital space. And operational metrics. In an enterprise context, this takes your internal view, so it's kind of measures of your operating efficiency. Task completion time, turnaround time, average handling time. These ultimately are metrics that we're going to be interested in if we're designing for an enterprise context. And it's important that we triangulate all of these pieces of data. It's not enough just to go with solicited. Why? Because not everyone will answer for requests for solicited feedback. We take behavioural data because only about 10 to 20% of what people say they're going to do, only about 10 to 20% of what people do can be explained by what they say they're going to do. But behavioural data doesn't necessarily tell us the why of what they did. And operational data is amazing because there's so much of it that you can really quickly identify problems before they impact customers and make steps to mediate those. But again, it won't necessarily tell you the why of the issue or why someone behaved in a certain way. And it doesn't tell you how customers feel. So ultimately we want to be collecting all three of these types. We can also look at measurement across 3 different levels of an organisation. So at the highest level, we've got organisation level data. Here we're interested in what is the customer's overall relationship with our organisation. So if you've got activity, environmental sustainability, corporate social responsibility, attitudes towards those types of things are going to crop up at this level. And some examples of those are brand score, trust score, NPS. At a service level, this is looking at the overall, what is the overall experience, customer experience of an end-to-end journey. Service level metrics are interesting because they can give you a bit of a reflection of how an organisation is performing across business units and the overall effectiveness, but they're a bit limited because they're not diagnostic. They don't tell us the why that a journey was compromised. And finally, we have it at an episode level, and as you move down this pyramid, the number of measures that you're going to be interested in increases as well. So the episode level is looking at a specific interaction within that customer journey and understanding what was the experience at that specific point in time. And measures like this are useful because they give you a measure of sort of a specific business unit or a specific touch point. And the focus here is on cause and effect. So how do we apply it? Let's start with an asset that most of you will have in your organisations currently, and that's just the standard sort of journey map. Here I've taken a very, very basic sort of end-to-end journey purchase map with the physical and the digital touch points all mapped out. So maybe just a quick test to see if you're listening. If I take website as an example, can anyone think of a solicited feedback type that we could collect for a website? Something you would ask someone on a website. Yes?
Survey?
Yep, survey.
Ask nicely where they get you to rate your experience with the website.
Yes, perfect. What about behavioural? So something you could observe someone doing or a bunch of people doing.
Clicks.
Clicks, yep.
Eye tracking.
Eye tracking, yes. Good one. What about operational data? Bit of a trickier one. Yep.
If you're tracking phone calls from the site, you could track inbound calls to a call centre.
Perfect, yep. Amazing. So now if we break one of these stages, and I'm going to just take purchase, because that's a pretty common one for most of us. If we break that down into a task level, so now we're interested in what are the discrete tasks that someone steps through, we can start to map quite a few more metrics at each of these points. So browsing behaviour, that's a behavioural one. Warehouse data, third-party logistics data, they're all operational. And return reasons and customer satisfaction surveys are examples of solicited feedback types. And fascinatingly, if you've got a 95% chance of nailing any one of these, there's still only a 60% chance that a customer's going to have a perfect end-to-end seamless experience. So if 95% of you are going to get it right in the first, and then 95% of that 95% nail it in the second, and then 95% of that 90%, it starts to decrease. So you can see why it's actually really important to be measuring at this level. But it's not just the moments that we're interested in, we're also interested in the experience and how a customer felt as they were transitioning through those moments. Because it's not just the moment need, but also the emotional need that is really what drives customer value and is going to drive them to or from your organisation. So let's take that store experience as an example. You might have some operational stuff around store sales and all that. But this is the story of a lady, and she went to the store. The store was really cramped, she could barely move her pram around. Walked up to the cashier didn't look at her until she said hello. She felt like she was an interruption to his day. They actually didn't have the item in stock. And then he said, oh, well, you can go online. Couldn't tell her if the stock was in stock online either. And so she decided not to make a purchase and left the store and probably won't go back. So how do we measure experience? Well, a really simple way is to leverage the experience principles that you've most likely also developed during various projects. Here are some examples of ones we came up with for some work I did recently for the workers' compensation scheme at icare. And a really simple way of doing this is just by taking that experience principle and creating a couple of items that measures how well you're tracking to that experience. And you don't necessarily need to embed it into your organisation, because I know that's hard, but if you just develop a few of these and then use it in your usability testing, instantly you've got something that's a bit more diagnostic than something like your system usability scale. And don't forget staff experience either. So what we did is also created a couple of, this is a call centre environment, support centre environment, and so we created some staff items too. So for example, with that second customer item, I understood the decision-making process and why I might receive a certain outcome. The sort of staff equivalent of that is I'm able to identify relevant processes, interpret and apply them. So for every customer experience, there's likely to be an equal staff experience. And it's really important that we take into account staff experience as well, because the staff experience with a product is often intrinsically linked to that customer experience, and their emotional needs are often just as complex as an external customer as well. So ask yourself questions like, what is the staff emotional need when they're using this system? When is that going to impact the customer? For example, in branches and retail, this is really important. What is the impact to the organisation when a staff has a negative experience? And what are some opportunities for us to make that a better experience for staff? All right, so maybe we don't see the value, and this also masquerades as I don't have the time, I don't have the scope, or I don't have the access. And I don't know about this one because I feel like ultimately people make time for the things that really matter. And I think we know in our hearts that UX is a really valuable exercise, but unless we can turn that value into something that's tangible and communicate in a language that our stakeholders understand, financial, then UX and CX is likely to continue to be seen as a really expensive luxury. And ultimately, you're always going to get hardline stakeholders who are like, you know what, we are here to do this. We are here to deliver X. Why should I care about customer experience? And you're going to tell them this. Ultimately, designing for customer experience and user experience is about driving customer behaviour. And the purpose of driving a certain customer behaviour, and that includes internal customers as well, our staff, is because there is a bottom line impact to the organisation. And when we can articulate that, when we can articulate the change in behaviour and what impact that is going to have on your organisation, that's when this stuff becomes extraordinarily powerful. So, busy slide, but here's just a few examples of some pretty common metrics, how they map to pretty common objectives, and then some examples of what the bottom line impact to the organisation is going to be. So I've just highlighted quite a common one for UX, which is reducing the amount of time it takes to complete a task. So through improvements to usability and onboarding, we are looking to reduce a time to complete a task. If you know what that was baseline, you know what that is currently, then you can start to calculate what are the impacts to the organisation. Find out what the training costs are around that system or service. Find out what it costs per hour in terms of staff wages and things like that to get certain things done, and how much more productive we can be at work. Find out what the average second improvement or minute improvement to your call handling time is worth to the organisation. It will blow your mind. Find out what the average marketing spend is to onboard a new customer, and you'll understand why we care about word of mouth referrals, because that cost decreases. If you're in government, find out what it costs the government to chase people down because they haven't paid their bill on time, because the bill payment system is so broken. Just pick any metric in the organisation you're working for and find out why they care about that in financial terms. So at workers' comp, one of the metrics we care about is the average number of days that it takes for an injured worker to get back to work. And if we can reduce that, even by a day, just through our processes, not through force or anything, it's worth you know, in the region of tens of millions of dollars to the New South Wales taxpayer. You know, I think something that our stakeholders often say is, oh, it's really expensive to do user experience and customer experience, but ultimately, if it's done right, it should actually reduce costs. And finally, something we might hear is, if we don't measure it, at least we can't have failed. And so we don't want to measure it. I get it. It takes a lot of courage to measure the impacts of the work you do. It's human nature to place higher value in the work that we create, because we've got, you know, this attachment to it, and we really don't want to hear negative feedback. It's quite confronting. You know, it's like an ugly baby. Who here has an ugly baby? Oh, okay, a couple bad parents up the back there. But that's okay. It's okay if your baby is ugly, because this is a baby that you can control. But, you know, not measuring is also crazy. It's like if you put your life savings into Bitcoin and then never opened your wallet to check your balance. Like, don't you want to know how your investment is performing? The market could have crashed. Like, you could be homeless and you don't know. You're just throwing thousands more dollars into something and you don't know how it's improving. It's crazy. But what if we don't see an effect? I know that's a scary thing as well, but that's okay. Customer and organisational change can be really slow. So just because you don't see an impact immediately doesn't mean you're not going to see an impact 6 or 12 months down the track, especially if you're trying to improve something like customer churn rate. That can take a while to see. But ultimately, like, one of the core concepts of agile methodology is continuous improvement. And so if we're not continuously measuring, how can we say that we're continuously improving? Maybe you've chosen the wrong metric. So go back to your original question and your original problem and your original behaviour you're trying to drive and work out, is this actually the metric that we should be looking for? And maybe there is no effect, and that's okay too, because it means you need to go back to the drawing board and try something else, and that's the whole purpose of experimentation in the first place. And if all else fails, just don't tell anyone. Okay, so I know this stuff can be a little bit overwhelming and a little bit intimidating, so I've broken it down into just a couple simple steps that you can take away with you and work on in your projects as of tomorrow. So I mentioned earlier that one of the major reasons we don't measure the success of our work is because we don't collect those baseline measures. So next time you're interviewing your stakeholders, which every research or design project should start with, ask them how they are KPI'd. How are their staff rewarded in this space? Find out what's important to them and what kind of improvement would be meaningful to them. Then be really clear on the objectives of your work and identify your measures of success. You don't even need to be the one to do the statistical analysis to get this done. You just need to know who to reach out to. Like, there are plenty of nerds in your organisation who live and breathe this stuff. So just ask for an introduction to whoever you can find that will help you quantify these things, and reach out to them. So prioritise your journey episodes, or maybe a screening your user flow, and just focus on that one. So you might prioritise that on severity, emotional impact, frequency, costs, and then I want you to identify just one solicited behavioural and operational metric that you could map to that step. Then for those 3 metrics, try to define the business impact and calculate the financial outcomes. Then just have a play around. You know, if you've identified a certain theme is driving 2% of complaints to your call centre, what would be the impact to revenue if you could decrease calls to the call centre by 2%? Or what would be the impact of reducing the time it takes to do a certain task by 25%? And embrace your ugly baby. All babies are beautiful. And I want to leave you with just one final thought. If your salary was directly linked to the outcomes that you create for the organisations, what would you do differently? some of you be homeless. I don't know. That would be. All right. Thank you for listening. That's it.
You're out of time for questions now? A little bit of time after you said my baby was ugly. Some questions?
Can we get the slide deck put up tomorrow?
Yeah, sure.
And I'm not sure if you're going to do a YouTube for this as well, because it's something to go back to quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually, one of the feedback we had from our previous talks was to put our content up, so Aaron's over there videoing, so we'll definitely put your talks up tonight, and we'll share the slides as well.
Thank you.
Where are the stats from?
Which stats specifically? The ones on the...
So like the 95% success rate?
That's just hypothetically.
That's hypothetical.
Yeah.
How can you calculate impact when you're launching a new product without any, context, or if you're launching something that's brand new, and how are you going to base your measurement?
Yeah. So for brand new product, ultimately there is still some customer behaviour that you're trying to drive. So I would go back to what is the purpose for that product coming to life, and just set the benchmarks. Just because you don't have the metrics to start with doesn't mean that you can't sort of use this view to work out, well, what strategically do we want to measure, especially if you've got a brand new product. And people are, you want to know what types of data should we be capturing, what kind of analytics should we be running and reporting. Just at least having an understanding of what are we trying to achieve and how are we going to measure it is going to help you at least set up that stuff. And if you've done any concept design or usability testing, you can still use a lot of these principles to work out, what changes are having an effect and how you can measure the impact of that experience.
Thanks.
Yep, go.
What are your measuring the success of a product when the product you've designed, when it goes to market, is so different from what you originally designed?
What you originally designed?
Yeah, so like say it goes through several changes,
Oh, okay.
many stakeholders and opinions, and by the time it goes to market, it's far different from...
In my view, a lot of this stuff is strategic and it shouldn't really change, but how you execute to that strategy is the part that changes a lot. So how you execute that through your product can change as much as you want, but at the end of the day, you're still trying to achieve the same thing. Ideally, you'd still have the same benchmarks, unless your product has changed completely, in which case, just go back to the drawing board and you can start measuring this at any point in time.
I just had a question. Do you have any case studies where measuring the impact of UX has been done well, that we could look at and go, hey, that's really cool, I can copy that, or I can do that?
Not off the top of my head, and not much that I could really share from my previous work. Does anyone else? I'll throw that out to the crowd. Yep.
I have one that I wouldn't be able to share from a client perspective, where we looked at it before and after in terms of an engagement metric, and you can see a change across that. So I can, obviously there won't be any branding on it, but we can share that outcome.
Yeah, great.
So my former life, I've only just started at Berwick, was marketing technology, and they have similar challenges with quantifying and actually being able to come to like finding the ROI figures for the technology goes. You'd be amazed at how many times you sit down with your stakeholder and say, what impact do you think this is going to make to you, and you work out that metric together. A, when it comes to the end, you're not quite there, you work it out together, they're kind of half responsible for it as well. And B, they're pretty open to turn around and say, well, I think if you can do this, you can get your 2% drive down here.
Yeah.
And actually, so if you're struggling to find one, ask.
Absolutely.
So here's what we're going to do. What do you think that's going to do to your business?
Yeah.
And then they're going to come up, because they kind of, it's our project, it's our baby, but these guys are putting their kind of reputation with their boss on the line. Have you guys ever bought anything at a company and had to sit down with the boss and say, can I buy this? It's going to be really cool, and then kind of really hope it's going to work. That's kind of what they're doing with you as well. So yeah.
Yeah. Agree. Yes.
So
So Forrester's CX playbook is really amazing for this. They've got 6 competencies of customer experience strategy and measurement is one, and it feeds into everything. If you have to pay for it, but if we pool our resources, maybe we get it.
I'm sure we can find a client to pay for it, that'd be good.
You cannot, like, if you search on Google, I've done this, you can find...
Pass that around, we'll just make some points.
Yeah, you can find, like, you can find some versions, especially around the 7 steps to a good measurement approach, and that's really helpful too.
You could probably buy one copy on ebook and then email it, right? Just a thought. Yeah.
Just last question.
We're all getting hammered and having to measure these NPS these days as UXers, and it's possible. So what's your thoughts on that?
Okay. I knew there'd be a question around NPS. So my thoughts on NPS, I've been doing some research because I want to believe, I really do, like you say, all the organisations are rabbiting on about NPS at the moment. My gut view on it is I don't think it's used in the way that it was intended, and I don't like the way that it's used today, mainly because at an aggregate level, which is like, oh, overall, we have a score of 30 or whatever it was, it's not diagnostic, it doesn't tell you where the issues are, so it's a metric, but it shouldn't be the metric. The other context, though, in which NPS can be really powerful is, again, if you can relate it back to what is the financial impact of a detractor versus a passive versus a promoter. Actually, on one of my previous slides, there was some research done by Harvard Business Review that saw that for transaction-based businesses, so sales businesses where they're relying on repeat customer return and loyalty, there was a difference of 140% spend for their greatest promoters versus their detractors. So then you have a case for saying, well, if we can move 5% of our detractors to passives or 5% of our passives to promoters, what is the impact of bottom line? The issue with NPS in most organisations and in my own as well is it's primarily kind of a measure of brand loyalty, and at icare it's a monopoly. You don't get a choice. There's no such thing really as loyalty. It sort of seems like a weird metric for us to be using, but they do because there's baselines and that kind of thing. So I would just encourage your stakeholders to work out, you know, what else are we measuring? Should we be measuring trust score, brand score, things like that, and also try and understand what is the financial impact of those 3 categories, and then it will start to make a bit more sense why we care about it.
I thought courage was a really good one. Like, that resonated with me a lot. You know, I find a lot of clients don't have the courage to want to measure and to do it properly, so I feel like your talk really helped enable us, so thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you.